A verse-by-verse study in the book of Genesis, ESV, with Irv Risch, chapter 40. What does Genesis chapter 40 mean? Joseph continues to languish in a special prison attached to the house of the captain of the guard, Genesis 39 verses 11 to 20. While Joseph's former master held that position, Genesis 39 verse 1, Scripture does not use the name Potiphar from this point forward. It's unclear if Potiphar is still in that role, or if he has been replaced. After Joseph has been there some time, likely several years, two new prisoners arrive. Pharaoh has become angry at both his chief cupbearer and his chief baker. He throws them into the prison, also called the pit or the dungeon, where Joseph is. Genesis doesn't tell us what their offenses were, Genesis 40 verses 1 to 3. Just as in his prior role, Joseph's diligence and character have led to recognition, Genesis 39 verses 21 to 23. He is given a kind of caregiver's role over these two new men. They, as well, are held for some time, likely another period of years. In a dictator-driven legal system, a prisoner might be subject to almost any fate at any time. One night, both men experience vivid, impactful dreams. Egyptian religion took dreams very seriously, but these are especially jarring visions. The men are disturbed enough by the dreams that Joseph takes notice, Genesis 40 verses 4 to 7. In response to their concern, Joseph assures them that God can interpret dreams, and Joseph will pass those truths along. The first man's dream involves 3 productive grapevines. Joseph indicates that the man will be restored to his former position in 3 days. In addition, Joseph asks the man to speak to Pharaoh on his behalf. While Joseph accepts God's will for his life, he also recognizes the opportunity to advocate for his own release, Genesis 40 verses 8 to 15. The second man's dream also implies a resolution in 3 days, but not a happy one. The expression, to lift one's head, evokes a person looking downwards in defeat or shame as their face is raised into a more confident posture, Psalm 3 verse 3. Both men will have their heads lifted by Pharaoh, but the baker will immediately be executed, and his corpse left to rot, Genesis 40 verses 16 to 19. These predictions come about exactly as Joseph predicted. 3 days later, the king brings out the 2 men as part of his birthday celebration. One is restored to his prior role, the other is killed and his body left for scavengers. Despite this, the newly freed cupbearer makes no mention of Joseph. Either out of fear, caution, or some other motive, he says nothing. He does not lose memory of Joseph, but forgets him by setting his plea out of his mind, Genesis 40 verses 20 to 23. It will be another 2 years before a situation inspires the cupbearer to mention Joseph and his remarkable ability, Genesis 41:1, 9 to 14. Chapter context: Joseph remains in prison after being accused of attempted rape by Potiphar's wife, Genesis 39 verses 11 to 15. The Lord blesses Joseph even in jail, Genesis 39 verses 21 to 23, but he longs to get out. His chance for release comes through an opportunity to interpret the dreams of 2 fellow prisoners. The dreams reveal that one will be restored to his old position, while the other will be killed. Joseph pleads with the servant to be restored, asking him to plead with Pharaoh to get Joseph released, but the man fails to do so. 2 years later, Genesis 41 verse 1, another dream requires explanation, and Joseph will finally be freed, Genesis 41 verses 12 to 14. Verse by verse. Verse 1. Some time after this, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker committed an offense against their lord the king of Egypt. Joseph, Genesis 37 verse 28, is in prison in Egypt. His jail is specially dedicated to the king's prisoners, and is somehow attached to the home of Potiphar, the captain of the guard, Genesis 40 verse 3. Potiphar is Joseph's former master, Genesis 39 verses 1 to 6. Joseph was falsely accused by Potiphar's wife of attempted rape, Genesis 39 verses 11 to 20. Although Joseph's circumstances are difficult, the Lord remains with him. God continues to bless Joseph with great success in everything he does. In fact, the keeper of the jail has put Joseph in charge of most of what goes on in the prison. While Scripture does not say exactly how long this has been, it has not been a brief stay. Joseph has been jailed for years and naturally wants to get out. 2 more high-ranking servants are added to the prison, the cupbearer and baker of Pharaoh, the Egyptian ruler. A cupbearer was an especially trusted servant who may have monitored the process of the winemaking from grapes to cup. Part of his role was to ensure, for instance, that the king was not poisoned. The king's chief baker may have supervised a team of bakers. Both men had committed an unnamed offense against the king. In the case of these 2 men, guilt is certain, as opposed to Joseph, who had been falsely accused. Context summary: Genesis 40 verses 1 to 23 takes place during Joseph's years in a prison, or dungeon, within the house of the captain of the guard. 2 men join him there for a time and experience troubling, prophetic dreams. Joseph's interpretation reveals that the former cupbearer to Pharaoh will be restored to his old job. The former baker for Pharaoh will be executed. Both interpretations are fulfilled exactly, but Joseph is soon forgotten again. Verse 2. And Pharaoh was angry with his 2 officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. Criminal justice in the court of an Egyptian pharaoh was fully one-sided. Accused criminals had no rights, especially foreign-born slaves. A powerful man, like Joseph's master Potiphar, Genesis 39 verse 1, could simply throw a servant in prison without any kind of trial or release date. It's conceivable he could have killed Joseph, given the nature of his accused crime, Genesis 39 verses 14 to 18. Joseph is not guilty, however, as the charge was invented by a bitter woman rejected in her attempt at seduction, Genesis 39 verses 6 to 12. Unlike Joseph, Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker were truly guilty of something. Scripture does not say what their crime was. It might have been as simple as irritating their king. We're also not told if they were both involved in the same offense, at the same time, or if their crimes were entirely separate. In any case, the king was enraged with them. They may have been foreign-born slaves, as was Joseph. Joseph's level of success was noteworthy, Genesis 39 verses 22 to 23, but it was not unusual for faithful slaves to become trusted servants of high-ranking officials. All 3 men would consider their prospects bleak, at best. Verse 3. And he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the prison where Joseph was confined. Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, was enraged at his cupbearer and baker, formerly trusted servants. We're not told what they did to make him angry. We do know they were cast into the same prison housing Joseph, Genesis 39 verses 11 to 20. He is there on a false charge, unlike the baker and cupbearer who are guilty of some crime. As before, Joseph's integrity and knack for success have made him rise to leadership, even within the prison, Genesis 39 verses 21 to 23. This prison is somehow attached to the house in which Joseph formerly served. While Joseph's Egyptian master was identified as the captain of the guard, Genesis 39 verse 1, the name Potiphar is no longer used in Joseph's story. For that reason, it's unclear if Potiphar is still in that position when these 2 men are brought in. Verse 4. The captain of the guard appointed Joseph to be with them, and he attended them. They continued for some time in custody. Though he is still confined to the king's prison after several years, Joseph's reputation as a faithful and trustworthy servant continues to grow, Genesis 39 verses 21 to 23. Joseph is here because of a false charge, brought by the wife of his former master, Potiphar, Genesis 39 verses 11 to 20. When he was first introduced, Potiphar was named as the captain of the guard, Genesis 37 verse 36, 39:1. Since Joseph was cast into prison, however, Scripture has only referred to the title, rather than a specific name. It's not clear if Potiphar is still in his position. Whomever the captain is, he recognizes Joseph's value, Genesis 39 verses 21 to 23, and appoints him to supervise 2 new prisoners. These are the former cupbearer and baker of Egypt's ruler, Pharaoh, Genesis 40 verses 1 to 3. It's not known if the captain of the guard who appoints Joseph to care for these high-ranking servants is still Potiphar or another. We're not told how long Joseph has been here, but it has likely been several years, at least. Just as he's been there for some time prior to the cupbearer and baker arriving, it will be some time before anything else changes. Verse 5. And one night they both dreamed, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, each his own dream, and each dream with its own interpretation. Regardless of specific titles, unbridled power tends to be used in haphazard, unpredictable ways. Egyptian pharaohs were subject to very few limits on their authority. The current pharaoh has thrown his cupbearer and baker into prison in a fit of rage. We're not told what they did, only that they're guilty of some offense, Genesis 40 verses 1 to 3. Once jailed, a prisoner could languish there indefinitely. No release dates were guaranteed. They might be suddenly executed or released if the king's anger cooled. Along with Joseph, the cupbearer and baker were stuck in this limbo as time passed. At this point, Joseph has likely been in jail for several years. Punished for a false charge, Genesis 39 verses 10 to 15, Joseph has been there for some time. And it is, again, some time before anything noteworthy happens with these new prisoners. Then, one night, both the cupbearer and the baker have remarkable dreams. These weren't ordinary experiences, or even vivid nightmares. Something about these visions made it clear they needed to be understood. Adding to their significance was the fact that both men's dreams occurred on the same night. These are prophetic dreams, pointing to a specific outcome in the lives of these 2 men. Verse 6. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were troubled. Joseph rose to a position of authority under his Egyptian master, Potiphar, Genesis 39 verses 1 to 6. He was unfairly jailed, based on a lie told by his master's wife, whose seduction Joseph had rejected, Genesis 39 verses 11 to 15. Joseph's character and skill make him valuable even in prison, Genesis 39 verses 21 to 23. Now, he has likely been in this state for several years. At some point during that stretch, the Egyptian pharaoh's cupbearer and baker are jailed for an unspecified offense, Genesis 40 verses 1 to 4. They've been there for some time, likely more than a few years. Strangely, both the king's former cupbearer and his former baker had powerful dreams on the same night. They're convinced that each dream means something specific, and they're right. Joseph finds the pair troubled or dejected the next morning. They cannot explain their dreams, but they know they are abnormal. That stress is obvious enough that Joseph sees it the next day. The following verses will reveal they have no way of understanding these obviously important dreams. Verse 7. So he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in custody in his master's house, "Why are your faces downcast today?" Joseph has been confined to prison for some time, likely several years, on a false charge, Genesis 39 verses 11 to 15. As he did in his first master's home, Joseph has made a name for himself and risen to a position of responsibility, though he is still an unwilling prisoner, Genesis 39 verses 21 to 23. After some years, the Egyptian king's cupbearer and baker are jailed, and Joseph is put in charge of their custody, Genesis 40 verses 1 to 3. This, as well, continues for some time, again probably a stretch of years. Genesis 40 verse 4. Then, on the same night, both the cupbearer and baker had powerful dreams. They cannot understand them, but they seem to realize they are not just dreams. These are visions of some kind which need to be explained. Both men are convinced their individual dreams mean something specific, and they're right. Joseph finds the pair disturbed the following morning, Genesis 39 verses 5 to 6, and asks what is bothering them. Verse 8. They said to him, "We have had dreams, and there is no one to interpret them." And Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me." Pharaoh's former cupbearer and baker sit languishing in prison for some untold crime, Genesis 40 verses 1 to 3. Their caretaker is also a prisoner, but one unfairly jailed for a false charge, Genesis 39 verses 11 to 15. Joseph has proven his use to the jailer and been given considerable responsibilities in the prison, Genesis 39 verses 21 to 23. That includes some authority over these two men, Genesis 40 verse 4. For all three men, their futures seem bleak. Recently, the baker and cupbearer are troubled for another reason. On the same night, they both had separate, deeply impactful dreams, Genesis 40 verses 5 to 7. The Egyptians held dreams to be very important, in general. They believed dreams allowed for contact with the dead and with the gods. Some Egyptians specialized in claiming to interpret significant-seeming dreams for people. The cupbearer and the baker cannot understand their visions, but they know they are important, Genesis 40 verses 5 to 6. They likely wished they could talk to one of those dream specialists. Joseph dismisses that superstition with a single statement, interpretations belong to God. Joseph saw his God as the revealer. Dream specialists were not required for someone who was in communication with the one, true God, as Joseph was. He asked the men to tell him the dreams, implying that God would give him the revelation and he would tell it to them. That's exactly what happens, Genesis 40 verses 9 and 16. Verse 9. So the chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph and said to him, "In my dream there was a vine before me." Ancient Egyptian culture invested great importance in dreams. Seers and mediums would claim to explain the meaning of visions. In prison, of course, there is no easy access to such a person. The now imprisoned cupbearer and baker for Pharaoh have both experienced prophetic dreams on the same night, Genesis 40 verses 1 to 8. Joseph, also in prison on a false charge, Genesis 39 verses 11 to 15, has stated that God, not man, can reveal the meaning of those dreams. When Joseph asks to hear the details of the men's dreams, they agree. The cupbearer goes first. He saw a grapevine in his dream, perhaps not surprising for someone whose business is wine. His vision will involve pressing grapes and giving the results to Pharaoh. Joseph will explain that this is a favorable sign, Genesis 40 verses 10 to 13. Verse 10. And on the vine there were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, its blossoms shot forth, and the clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's former cupbearer and baker, Genesis 40 verses 1 to 4, imprisoned with Joseph, Genesis 39 verses 11 to 15, have both dreamed prophetic dreams on the same night, Genesis 40 verses 5 to 8. Joseph, claiming that God will reveal the meaning of those dreams, has asked to hear them. The cupbearer's dream involved a grapevine, Genesis 40 verse 9, no surprise for someone whose profession involved wine. In his dream, the vine's 3 branches developed into ripe grapes extremely quickly. Modern readers might picture a time-lapse video of grapes growing. The cupbearer will continue to explain how he gives the results to Pharaoh, and Joseph will explain this to be a good sign, Genesis 40 verses 11 to 13. Verse 11. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. A man who was cupbearer to Egypt's ruler has been imprisoned for an unexplained crime, Genesis 40 verses 1 to 3. Also in this prison is Joseph, Genesis 39 verses 11 to 15, 40:4, though his charge is false. Both the cupbearer and another prisoner have experienced vivid, impactful dreams on the same night. In distress, they speak to Joseph. He promises that he can pass along God's interpretation of the dreams, Genesis 40 verses 5 to 8. The cupbearer's dream included a vine with 3 branches rapidly growing until it produced ripe grapes, Genesis 40 verses 9 to 10. The man saw himself pressing the grapes, squeezing out their juice, into Pharaoh's cup and placing the cup in Pharaoh's hand. In whole, the dream sounds very much like what the cupbearer may have done in his former position with the king. As it turns out, this former role is also his future destiny, Genesis 40 verses 12 to 13. Verse 12. Then Joseph said to him, this is its interpretation, the 3 branches are 3 days. Joseph is falsely imprisoned, Genesis 39 verses 11 to 15, but his integrity and skill have not gone unnoticed, Genesis 39 verses 21 to 23. While languishing in jail, 2 other prisoners arrived, the cupbearer and baker of Egypt's ruler, the Pharaoh, Genesis 40 verses 1 to 3. Given some sort of caretaker's role, Joseph noticed the men's distress the morning after they both had vivid, prophetic dreams, Genesis 40 verses 5 to 6. He reassured them that God could provide an interpretation, offering to pass along God's wisdom, Genesis 40 verses 7 to 8. The cupbearer's dream involved seeing a 3-branched vine rapidly grow into ripened grapes. He then pressed the grapes and gave the results to Pharaoh, Genesis 40 verses 9 to 11. In Scripture, numbers seen in dreams often contain some specific significance. This will feature in dreams later in Joseph's life, as well, Genesis 41 verses 1 to 8. Joseph begins to interpret the cupbearer's dream by noting that the 3 branches represent 3 days. This will lead to a happy prediction for the jailed man, Genesis 40 verse 13. Verse 13. In 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office, and you shall place Pharaoh's cup in his hand as formerly, when you were his cupbearer. Joseph is interpreting the cupbearer's dream, Genesis 40 verses 9 to 11. This man was imprisoned, along with the Egyptian king's former baker, for an unnamed crime, Genesis 40 verses 1 to 3. A disturbingly vivid dream, Genesis 40 verses 5 to 6, led Joseph, also jailed, Genesis 39 verses 11 to 15, to offer insight into God's interpretation of the dream, Genesis 40 verses 7 to 8. The cupbearer's dream depicted a 3-branched vine rapidly growing grapes, which the cupbearer then pressed and gave to Pharaoh, Genesis 40 verses 9 to 11. According to Joseph, 3 branches in the dream represent 3 days, Genesis 40 verse 12. That's how many days will pass before Pharaoh releases the cupbearer from prison and gives him his job back. Symbolically, to lift someone's head is to encourage or validate them. The imagery is of a person with their face down, raising their head into a more confident posture, Psalm 3 verse 3. Pharaoh will lift up the cupbearer's head, now hanging in shame, and restore him to his former position. This is good news for the cupbearer, and possibly for Joseph, as well. Knowing the man will be released, and that the cupbearer is familiar with Joseph's situation, there is hope. Perhaps the soon-to-be-released man will speak well of Joseph and ask Pharaoh to free him, Genesis 40 verses 14 to 15. Verse 14. Only remember me, when it is well with you, and please do me the kindness to mention me to Pharaoh, and so get me out of this house. Joseph has interpreted the cupbearer's dream, Genesis 40 verses 7 to 11, and the outcome is a happy one. The cupbearer will be released from prison and given his old job back as Pharaoh's cupbearer in just 3 days, Genesis 40 verses 12 to 13. Now Joseph makes a personal plea to the cupbearer, remember me. Specifically, Joseph asks that when the time is right, when it is well with the cupbearer, that he mention Joseph to Pharaoh. This is Joseph's attempt to be freed from his unfair imprisonment, Genesis 39 verses 11 to 15. This is an entirely reasonable request, even if it's the first time we hear Joseph express discontent with his difficult circumstances. Many years have passed since Joseph was first incarcerated for a crime he did not commit, Genesis 40 verses 1 and 4, and he's ready to be done with prison. Joseph is not despairing or rejecting God's will. Nor is he being inert, doing literally nothing. Instead, he sees a perfect opportunity to plead his case. Joseph is aware of how powerful a well-timed word from an influential servant can be. He asks the cupbearer to do that kindness for him. Unfortunately, the cupbearer will keep that information to himself for several more years. Genesis 41 verses 1 and 9. Verse 15. For I was indeed stolen out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also I have done nothing that they should put me into the pit. The former cupbearer to Pharaoh, Egypt's king, will be restored to his office in 3 days. This is the interpretation Joseph has given the jailed man, in response to the cupbearer's dream, Genesis 40 verses 9 to 13. Since this was revealed to him by God, Joseph has no doubt it will happen. He is so confident, in fact, that he pleads with the cupbearer to put in a good word for him to Pharaoh when the time is right, to get him out of prison, Genesis 40 verse 14. For the first time, we hear Joseph express how he feels about his captivity. He describes himself as one stolen out of the land of the Hebrews. Taking free men captive and selling them as slaves, even in that era, was seen as unfair treatment and would later be made a crime punishable by death under God's law, Exodus 21 verse 16. Making matters worse, Joseph wasn't so much stolen as sold by his own brothers, in an act of deep betrayal, Genesis 37 verses 26 to 28. In addition, Joseph wants the cupbearer to understand, and to communicate to Pharaoh, that he is not guilty of the attempted rape of his master's wife, Genesis 39 verses 8 to 15. He does not deserve his imprisonment. This is not a faithless act on Joseph's part. God does not demand his people do literally nothing to improve their lives. Rather, Joseph is taking an excellent opportunity to plead his case. As it happens, his plea will work, but not for at least 2 more years, Genesis 41 verses 1 and 9. Verse 16. When the chief baker saw that the interpretation was favorable, he said to Joseph, I also had a dream, there were 3 cake baskets on my head. Joseph has volunteered, through revelation from his God, to interpret the prophetic dreams of 2 different men with him in prison, Genesis 40 verses 5 to 8. The cupbearer's dream revealed he would soon be released and fully restored to his old position, Genesis 40 verses 9 to 13. Joseph was confident enough in this outcome that he asked the cupbearer to appeal to Pharaoh on his behalf, Genesis 40 verses 14 to 15. As one might think, the baker is hopeful for a similar report from Joseph. The baker begins to describe his dream, where he carried 3 cake baskets on his head. In that era, it was common to carry baskets and other vessels on one's head. People around the world today still use this method to transport food, goods, or water using baskets and jars. A baker would have been familiar with transporting baked goods in this way. Verse 17. And in the uppermost basket there were all sorts of baked food for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating it out of the basket on my head. Relying on revelation from God, Joseph has promised to interpret the dreams of 2 fellow prisoners, Genesis 40 verses 1 to 8. These prophetic visions left the men disturbed and confused. The first dream, seen by the cupbearer, was a prediction that he would be restored to his former position, Genesis 40 verses 9 to 13. Joseph is so certain of this that he asked the cupbearer to put in a good word for him, with Pharaoh, Genesis 40 verses 14 to 15. Seeing the good outcome predicted by the other man's vision, the baker is hopeful for a similar report, Genesis 40 verse 16. In his dream, he carries 3 cake baskets on his head, perhaps delivering them to Pharaoh. The top basket is full of all kinds of baked goods. Egyptians were known for skill in making cakes and breads. In the dream, birds were eating Pharaoh's baked goods from the top basket above the baker's head. Joseph will interpret the dream in the following verses, but the outcome will not be what the baker had hoped, Genesis 40 verses 18 to 19. Verse 18. And Joseph answered and said, This is its interpretation, the 3 baskets are 3 days. Joseph has interpreted the cupbearer's dream. He would be restored to his position in 3 days, Genesis 40 verses 9 to 13. Now Joseph interprets the baker's dream, Genesis 40 verses 16 to 17. Unlike the cupbearer, whose future involves restoration, the outcome is far less favorable for the baker. Numbers seen in biblical dreams often carry deep significance, Genesis 37 verse 9, 41:1-8. Joseph begins by noting that the 3 baskets the baker carried on his head represent 3 days. This is just as the 3 branches in the cupbearer's dream represented 3 days. Both men will see their fates revealed in that time, but the baker's will be an unhappy one, Genesis 40 verse 19. Verse 19. In 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head from you, and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat the flesh from you. With revelation from God, Joseph is interpreting the dreams of his fellow inmates, Genesis 40 verses 4-8. Having completed the cupbearer's positive interpretation, Genesis 40 verses 9-13, Joseph proceeds to interpret the baker's prophetic dream. The baker had dreamed that birds were eating baked goods from the topmost of 3 baskets he carried on his head, Genesis 40 verses 16-17. Joseph has told him that the 3 baskets represent 3 days. Now he delivers the devastating conclusion: in 3 days, the baker will be killed by Pharaoh and hung from a tree. The birds will eat his flesh. Speaking to the cupbearer, Joseph indicated Pharaoh would lift up his head, Genesis 40 verse 13. This phrase is usually used as a symbol of reassurance or victory. The imagery is of a person with their face turned down in sorrow, only to have it raised up in victory, Psalm 3 verse 3. In the baker's case, Joseph uses the same phrase, only to clarify that the baker's head will be literally removed from his body. This most likely means the baker will be decapitated, though it might simply be a reference to an execution. What is clear is that the man's corpse will be hung and left to be desecrated by scavenger birds. Under the Egyptian worldview of the time, this may have been done to keep a person's spirit from finding rest in the afterlife. Verse 20. On the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, he made a feast for all his servants and lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among his servants. Joseph's interpretations of the prophetic dreams of his fellow inmates come to pass exactly as he said, Genesis 40 verses 7-8. On the 3rd day, both men left the prison, Genesis 40 verses 13 and 19. The figure of speech about lifting up one's head is a reference to victory or redemption. It implies someone moving from shame and fear into confidence and validation, Psalm 3 verse 3. Unfortunately for one of these men, that validation will be short-lived, as will he, Genesis 40 verse 22. The birthday of a nation's king would have been cause for wide celebration. Likewise celebrated was the annual anniversary of his taking the throne. It was common for such kings to grant pardons on those days. On this date, Pharaoh frees these 2 men from prison, Genesis 40 verses 1-3, and lifts up the heads of both. Only one will experience a lasting forgiveness. Verse 21. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. On Pharaoh's birthday, he removes both the chief cupbearer and the chief baker from prison, Genesis 40 verses 1-3. Both men have their heads lifted up, Genesis 40 verse 20, a symbolic phrase referring to forgiveness and redemption, Psalm 3 verse 3. Just as Joseph predicted from the cupbearer's dream, Genesis 40 verses 12-13, the cupbearer is given his old job back. Once more, he finds himself placing Pharaoh's cup in his hand just as he had done before he was imprisoned. Joseph, more importantly, his God, have proved to be exactly right in explaining the meaning of troubling dreams. Eventually, this reputation will earn Joseph his freedom, Genesis 41 verses 12-14. The other man whose head is lifted, the baker, will experience disaster after this initial moment. Rather, just as predicted, he will be executed and his body left for scavengers. Genesis 40 verses 16 to 19, 22. Verse 22. But he hanged the chief baker, as Joseph had interpreted to them. Just as Joseph said, Genesis 40 verses 12 to 13, Pharaoh has returned his former chief cupbearer to his prior job. Genesis 40 verse 21. Joseph's explanation of the chief baker's fate also proves deadly accurate. Genesis 40 verses 18 to 19. Pharaoh also lifts up the man's head. Genesis 40 verse 20, Psalm 3 verse 3, only to then execute the baker and leave his corpse hanging for scavengers to defile. We're not told what charges were brought against either the cupbearer or the baker. Genesis 40 verses 1 to 3. It's possible neither of them was guilty of a literal crime other than offending the Pharaoh. Joseph, for his part, was truly innocent. Genesis 39 verses 11 to 15, 40:14-15. The impression we're left with is that justice for slaves and servants under the Pharaoh in Egypt was based entirely on the whims of the king. What's certain is the reliability of God to reveal to Joseph the true meaning of prophetic dreams. This fact will become crucial in Joseph's life, but only several years later. Genesis 41 verse 1, 9-14. Verse 23. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. This verse lands like a thud at the end of the chapter. Joseph was wrongfully imprisoned, Genesis 39 verses 11-15, and there met two former employees of Egypt's ruler, Pharaoh, Genesis 40 verses 1-4. When the two men had vivid, prophetic dreams, Joseph was able to interpret them through the power of God, Genesis 40 verses 5-8. One of the men, the baker, had a dream which predicted his impending death, Genesis 40 verses 16-19. The other, the cupbearer, dreamt about his future restoration, Genesis 40 verses 12-13. Both fates came about exactly as Joseph had said, Genesis 40 verses 20-22. When Joseph successfully interpreted the cupbearer's dream, he pleaded with the man to remember him. Knowing he was falsely accused, Joseph asks the man to put in a good word for him to Pharaoh, Genesis 40 verses 14-15. Joseph desperately wanted to be released from prison for a crime he did not commit. This is not a lack of trust on Joseph's part, but a sensible response to a good opportunity. Despite everything Joseph predicted coming true, by God's revelation, down to the smallest detail, the chief cupbearer was not impressed enough to pass along Joseph's plea. He does not tell of his experience with Joseph until years later, Genesis 41 verses 1 and 9. The concept of forgetting, in English, almost always implies a complete lack of awareness. When someone literally forgets a thing, they have no memory of it. However, the Hebrew root word shakach also includes the idea of ignoring something or setting it aside, Genesis 27 verse 45, Job 19 verse 14, Psalm 31 verse 12, Ecclesiastes 9 verse 15. In this case, it is a deliberate forgetting which comes from the cupbearer. He does not lose memory of what happened, but he chooses to say nothing. Perhaps he is afraid to stir up any more controversy. He may have felt that asking anything of Pharaoh, in that moment, would have been too audacious. Joseph would remain forgotten in prison for another 2 years, Genesis 41 verse 1. Though God was with Joseph and blessed him, Joseph's circumstances continued to be very difficult. God had not forgotten him, though, and God's plan for Joseph and Israel continued according to his own schedule, Genesis 45 verse 5, 50:20. End of chapter 40. Please note: the material use in this video is from BibleRef.com, which is from Got Questions Ministries and is posted here to be read by immersive reader in the Edge browser. If you copy this material, please follow these rules. Content from BibleRef.com may not be used for any commercial purposes, or as part of any commercial work, without explicit prior written consent from Got Questions Ministries. Any use of our material should be properly credited. Please make it clear the content is from BibleRef.com. BibleRef.com content may not be altered, modified, or otherwise changed unless such changes are specifically noted.